Hello, I'm Linda Elder. I am an educational psychologist and president of the Foundation for Critical Thinking. Welcome to this session, this conversation, critical thinking conversation with our fellows. We're focused today on the idea of using the tools of critical thinking for effective decision making. I'm going to be referring to one of our books entitled Critical Thinking: Tools for Taking Charge of Your Learning and your Professional and Personal Life. And so if you have the book, you may want to pull that out. If you don't, I'll be giving you some page numbers which you can look at later if you'd like to go deeper into these ideas. There are many angles from which we can approach effective decision making. We are going to focus on a couple of those hopefully fruitful angles here in this session. I've chosen to focus on two major areas in decision making. One on big decisions, the big decisions that we're making, the big decisions that we have made, the big decisions that we may make in the future. And the second is considering alternatives when making decisions. And really a third will be connecting these two discussions with the first principles of critical thinking or the primary tools that have been articulated in the field of critical thinking studies to this point. First, let's talk about the big decisions that you have made to this point, and consider these decisions from a rather deep approach in comparison to the approaches that we tend to see taken in human societies today. In the past 20 or 30 years, we have seen an explosion of pop psychology literature focusing on decision making. Much of this literature promises to change our lives overnight if we follow these 1, 2, 3-step approaches to decision making. Some of these books offer these 1, 2, 3-step approaches, again, that are procedural, that we are to follow, and they offer trees for us to follow. This is one pattern that we see in this literature. Another pattern that we see is an emphasis on one or two, let's say, powerful ideas in critical thinking, but offering these one or two ideas as it were the whole enchilada. But when we understand the complexities in human decision making and in living a human life, then we ask deeper questions, because we understand that these superficial approaches aren't getting us far enough in the direction of cultivating fair-minded critical societies, or for us personally making the highest level decisions in our own lives. In chapter 9 of our book, we focus on the art of making intelligent decisions. And I suggest that you spend some time with the introductory material, and I'm just going to bring in a few of the ideas that you'll see there for you now. And I'm beginning on page 183 and 84, and I'll just be summarizing some of our points that we're making in this chapter. Let me read some of these points to you and then discuss. The most basic patterns of thought and behavior in your life represent the most basic decisions you have made. So let's bring this to reality for us. Let me say this in other words. The basic ways in which you are living today and thinking today come from, or can be found in, or are implied by the most basic decisions, the big decisions you've made to this point. So take your intimate relationship, or relationships. You've made decisions, big decisions that have led you to this path. And perhaps you've made some decisions regarding intimate relationships in your life that have not been so good, and you've felt the consequences of those poor decisions in a very important area of your life. And so, and let me take this further. The most important decision we can make is how and what to think about the ways in which we're living our lives, how we think, how we feel, what we want. In other words, we need to take a much higher level of command of the decisions that we're facing every day, that we're making by implication, but that we maybe even don't realize that we're making. And so again, one thing that we can do is to look at the domains in our lives in which the important domains of our lives, and ask ourselves, well, what decisions have I made to this point that have led me here? If I can understand that, then I can understand the decisions I'm likely to make in the future and where those decisions are likely to lead me. So I will have much higher command over the decisions that I make in the future if I can command understanding of the decisions I've made in the past, the big ones that have led me here, and the decisions I'm making right now. So let us look at an activity that we can engage in, that comes from the book that I'm focusing on, and it comes from page 187. We've just lifted this this test the idea uh, experience for you to help you take theory that I'm focusing on and bring this into your thinking in a way that brings it alive and gives you leverage for making different decisions potentially in the future. And this is just the kind of activity that we want to engage our students in, so that they are not just hearing the theoretical points that we're making, but they're also applying the theoretical points as we move through the content of the course. So let's look at this activity. I want you to spend just a few minutes on this. You won't have time to write this down probably. You can find this activity again on page 187 of the book. Right now, I'd like you to just take some notes as if you were going to answer this or complete these statements. So, looking back on your life to this point, consider the big decisions you've made or are making and complete these statements. Now, you'll need to focus on one at a time. So, what is the big decision that you've made, either deliberately or not? In other words, you may have gone along with some decision that someone else made for you. That was a decision that you made. And so you made this decision by implication, by going along and not saying, no, I don't want to do that. What is this big decision? What are some important consequences of this decision for your life now? And what are some possible implications of this decision you've already made for the future? And as important, what might you change? Number 4, I might change the course of my future by changing my thinking in this situation or with regard to this situation in the following ways. So I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to consider this big decision and begin to answer these questions. So let me add just a few thoughts on recognizing the need for important decisions and thinking about this concept of big decisions more deeply than we tend to, and then we'll move on to our next major point. There are many questions that we can ask about the big decisions that face us or are facing us or have faced us in our lives. And I'm just going to articulate these in slightly different ways for your consideration. One thing I could ask myself is, am I happy with the way that I'm living my life now? If I am, truly and honestly, then it's likely that I have made some very good decisions to this point. But if I am happy in certain parts of my life, but not happy in other parts of my life, if I were to look at my life honestly, then as a critical thinker, I'm going to be interested in those areas of my life in which I'm not happy, and I'm going to be focusing on those. And I'm going to take that seriously, those problems within that domain seriously, and I'm going to ask myself, well, why am I not happy and what can lead to that happiness? How can I get command over the big decisions that I'm making in my life so that I can reach a higher level of self-realization or happiness, or however we may explain that higher level of living. So, what big decisions are you now facing? How are you approaching these big decisions? Which big decisions would you rather avoid, or are you avoiding making, and why? What are the most significant issues in your life that you need to face and to deal with? You see, I'm articulating the same ideas in slightly different ways to take me to a deeper and deeper level of realization of the need to face these big decisions that I may want to avoid making. And if I'm uncomfortable right now because there's an area of my life that I really don't want to face, that's the area that the highest level critical thinker will walk into and say, I want to deal with all of these problems and I want to deal with them now because they're big and they're affecting the quality of my life. So these are some thoughts on big decisions. We're going to come back in a minute to these big decisions and link this to our overall theory. Let's consider now alternatives. Often we fail, our thinking fails at the level not only of understanding that we have a big decision before us that we're not facing, um, but also we often fail at the level of failing to recognize alternatives. The critical mind is also the creative mind. If a mind is truly critical, it is not criticizing in the sense of simply looking for problems in someone's thinking or an issue. The person who's the cynic, no, the person who's truly critical in view and in worldview, who's developed her critical capacities or his critical capacities, is also highly creative and considers alternatives naturally over time. That is, as you get better and better at thinking about alternatives and considering them, the these alternatives begin to come to you more automatically as you reason through these big decisions because you've opened your mind to possibilities. You're not afraid of ideas. Maybe 9 of these 10 ideas that you generate won't work. Maybe they're not feasible, but you needed to go through the 9 to get to the 10th, which is feasible and will solve the problem or lead us to some higher plane, some higher level of living. So often we again fail to consider alternatives because our thinking is simply not open-minded enough. We're shutting down. We're closing down the alternatives rather than saying, well, let's see. Let's just throw these out there and see what may follow if we take this path versus if we take this path. Here is another activity from our book, and this comes from page 189. Again, it asks you to reflect on an experience that you've had recently. So think of the situation you were in recently in which you were not considering alternatives that, if you had considered, would have raised your thinking to a higher level of quality. Complete these statements. The situation was, now I want you to describe the situation. Again, I'll give you a few minutes to do this, so go ahead and begin as you wish. The alternatives I could clearly see at the time were these. The important alternatives I missed, though, were these. And the reason I missed them was because, and had I considered all the relevant important alternatives, I would have acted in the following ways rather than the ways that I did act. So do you notice in the process that we detail or that we lay out here for you, the reader, we're asking you to first tell us about the situation, then get further into the problem or the issue. Here I'm asking you to consider alternatives that you could see and alternatives that you missed, and I want to know why you missed them. I can apply this to myself when I'm focusing on a problem or a problem in my life, and I'm thinking of why it didn't work out the way that I thought it should have or could have, then I'm going to ask myself, which alternatives did I miss and why? Why wasn't I seeing those? Because I need to see those sorts of alternatives next time to avoid this same kind of problem. And that gets you into the fifth um, point here. So let me pause, give you just 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes or so to write out your initial thoughts on this. Let us continue, and I would like to make some additional comments about the importance of accurately recognizing alternatives, and then we'll move forward to our theory of critical thinking and link some of these thoughts to that theory. People often fail in the area of considering alternatives at two levels or in two forms. One is erroneously believing that something is an alternative when it is not, or in other words, thinking unrealistically. So people who are believing that something is an alternative when it's not realistic. And the other is failing to recognize an alternative or thinking too narrowly. And I focus a little bit on that second point already when I mentioned that the critical mind is naturally also the creative mind. Consider these types of things that people might say when they are thinking erroneously about alternatives. They're thinking unrealistically. These are in quotes. I know he's got major faults, but he loves me and I can help him change. So this is the naive uh, female who thinks that she is going to be able to change this male that she's in an intimate relationship with, though he has got major faults. But he loves me. You see, that's unrealistic thinking. And here's another. I know there are lots of problems in our relationship, but we love each other, and that is all that matters. Again, the same problem. If there are lots of problems in our relationship, then how can we be happy in those conditions? It's not realistic to think that we will be happy. And then we ask ourselves, what is the sacrifice that we're willing to make for staying in that situation? Another, I know I'm not doing well at my job, but I will eventually be recognized. I know I'm not doing well at my job. So it's unrealistic to then therefore think that you're going to be recognized if you're not doing well at your job. Another student problem in thinking. I know I need to learn this, but I can learn it by cramming the night before the exam. It's unrealistic, but it's also something that we as teachers have to take some responsibility for because we've taught students that this is what learning entails. We've taught them that learning is something that it's not and that they can actually approach learning in this way. That's not realistic. That's not how you're going to learn. That's not how you're going to discipline your mind. That's not how we're going to transform human societies to more civilized societies, to ones that value fair-minded critical thinking and foster intellectual virtues. So these are some considerations when we think about alternatives, opening our mind, considering alternatives, not closing the mind down, but also understanding the importance of being realistic in this approach. Now, I would like to link some of the thoughts that we've been discussing with the theory of critical thinking that is at the heart of our approach. Now, we could begin a session on effective decision making by focusing on these elements of reasoning. We can start here rather than from the point that I started, because I can say whenever we are facing any decision, it's essential that we understand, or let's say important decision, that we understand the elements of reasoning embedded in our thinking. And so I could say, and there's a lot of fruitfulness in taking this approach. So I could say, if you are facing a major decision, write out your purpose. What is the purpose of the decision, or what is the question at issue? What exactly is the problem? Articulate this complex problem multiple ways before you begin to approach it, because if you do, your thinking will be better by implication because of the pre-thinking that you're doing here, focusing on the question. I can say think through the information, make sure you gather the relevant information, the information that is relevant to solving this problem. I can say beware of the interpretations that you're making as you move through the process. Beware of your inferences. And understand that when you come to this final decision, it's a conclusion or it is hopefully a solution, but it certainly is an inference. In other words, it's a step of the mind in which the mind says, I've considered all of these possibilities. I'm going to make this big decision, and here is going to be my major inference or my main conclusion. I'm going to decide to marry this woman or not, or I'm going to approach my students in the classroom in the following ways when I enter the new semester because I've made these new big decisions. These are inferences, these are steps of the mind. And therefore, therefore we understand, if we understand this, that when we make this inference, or we decide in the following way, we could have made some other inference or some other sets of inferences and gone some other path. We could have said, no, I don't think this person is going to really make me happy, and so I'm going to say no to this relationship. Um, or when thinking about the impact of our behavior on the earth, we have big decisions to make here. How are we making these big decisions? What inferences are we coming to about the earth, the health of the earth, and how we should be behaving as actors upon the earth, affecting the earth? So I can approach big decisions from these elements of reasoning. I can say, what concepts are you using to begin your thinking? Where does your thinking begin when you think about, for instance, the health of the earth or the condition of the earth and its the condition of its resources, the condition of the air, the water, so forth. I can say, what concepts am I beginning with when I approach this big problem? Well, if I'm thinking environmentally, then I'm going to use environmental theories. I'm going to use scientific theories, which will help me understand the impact of human action on the earth. And I'm going to avoid using concepts like what is in my vested interest or what is best for me right now at this moment, living in a highly superficial world, uh, in highly superficial human societies. You see, so our concepts are our beginning places, and they're a good place for us to begin to think about how we're defining these big decisions at the very foundation. And then I could ask, what is our assumption base? What do we assume to begin with? Do we assume that the Earth can manage an unlimited number of people living on the planet in the form that we've been living, or the forms we've been living on it? Is this an assumption that we make? Or do we assume that there is a limit to how much pressure a fragile ecosystem like the Earth can take? What are our assumptions? Where is our beginning place? In that intimate relationship, where are your assumptions? What is your beginning place? What do you take for granted about a relationship? We can relate this to any number of decisions that we make as administrators. We must hire individuals to work in certain positions, and we make assumptions about those individuals. We bring those assumptions in the room. We want to ask ourselves, what are those assumptions, and are they justifiable in this context? We can ask ourselves about the implications of hiring this individual versus this other individual. What might be implied by his attitude or his orientation towards this set of problems? Uh, and in fact, we'll see what the consequences are when and if we hire this individual, because we'll experience the person's thinking in action every day. And we can also enter the point of view, we can also enter the elements of reasoning and therefore decision making from the point of view. So we can ask ourselves, how am I looking at these decisions that I'm making? How am I looking at the department in which I'm functioning? How do I look at the problems that we face as a community? How do I look at problems as an administrator, as a decision maker? What point of view, what frames of reference, what worldview, what perspectives, what orientations do I bring into the room? And by implication, what points of view do others bring into the room that I need to consider? Notice I've been focusing on the elements of reasoning, the elements of thought. All of these will be directly applicable to any decision that we make, because whenever we're reasoning through any problem or issue, these parts are present, whether we realize that they're present or not. We're using these elements. Each of us is using these elements as reasoners when we're approaching discussions regarding decision making. And then we can ask ourselves, to what extent are we applying this intellectual standards to this process? Intellectual standards are the standards by which intellectuals or good reasoners judge reasoning, and they're the standards by which intellectuals have always judged reasoning throughout human history. We pull together these standards. We have 9 here. We tend to focus on, fundamentally in our work, we consider these essential intellectual standards, but they come from a much larger group of intellectual standards that exist in all natural languages, or the languages that we speak every day. In this case, I'm speaking English. Some of you speak other language as your primary language, but whatever that language is, will be your natural language. Within these languages, we have these standards that we've been developing and accumulating throughout human recorded history. And the important point for us now is that if we're making big decisions, then we need to be adhering to these intellectual standards systematically. And to do that, we must have a deep enough understanding of them to be able to leverage their use in context. So if we go back to, for instance, the 2 main areas that we focused on today, the first was focusing on big decisions that we're now facing. I want to enter this theory at this standard, the standard of significance. We've been focusing on a decision or a problem. That's the element of reasoning of problems or question. And we focused mainly on this question of this standard of significance. And I asked you to apply the standard of significance to some of the decisions you've made in your life. And I've argued that it is these big decisions that have largely led you to this point. And so if we enter now the discussion at the point of view of intellectual standards, then we see that significance is a key standard, an essential intellectual standard that we should be using as reasoners every day, because we face many problems, questions, concerns. We're faced with a huge amount of data. We've got groups, companies, organizations all over the world trying to enter our world with their data, with their information, with their arguments. And they're saying, hey, I'm significant. Give to my cause. Follow my lead. Follow my path. So we as thinkers have to make these important decisions more or less every day as to how to spend our time and whether this is a significant use of our time, whatever this is that we're being asked to do, or that we're doing, engaging in ourselves, the decisions that we're choosing the paths that we're choosing, let's make sure they are significant paths. That's the argument. In looking at our second, uh, um, let's say, focus, we were primarily concerned with considering alternatives. And so we wanted to make sure that we were considering the relevant information, relevant alternatives, and we want to think about those alternatives deeply. And we may have to consider multiple viewpoints in considering the alternatives, so we need to think maybe broadly. We may need to unpack the decision, the problem, the issue in multiple ways to understand what the problem is that we're actually facing, to pull the problem apart into multiple questions that we can deal with as individual questions, but then also recognizing them as a cluster of existing as in a cluster of questions. So we can enter this same content, considering alternatives from the point of view of intellectual standards, as I'm doing here. We can also enter at the point of view of the elements of reasoning again. So if I'm reasoning through a big decision and I need to consider alternatives by implication, then again, what's the question at issue? Articulate that precisely. What is our purpose? Are we clear about our purpose? Uh, and then here is where the focus on alternatives to me really comes into play in a, let's say, in a way that's easily illuminated. We have to gather data, facts, and evidence to consider the alternatives. And so we want to consider a sufficient amount of information to solve this big problem or make this big decision. So often we fail at the level of considering all of the relevant information. We often fail at the point of considering alternative points of view when considering alternatives. Often we're not thinking through implications, or we're failing to see the assumptions you see that we're making. What I want you to see is the dynamic way in which the elements of reasoning exist in the mind, in the human mind, and the many avenues for entering decision making that exist and that we're already taking because we're already considering our purpose. We're already considering questions at issue, but we're not necessarily unpacking these ideas and using this language as a framework for reasoning through these problems, these decisions that we're facing every day. And we need to make sure that we are, again, adhering to intellectual standards in this process. Now, I have not talked about the third conceptual set in our approach, in our framework, and that is intellectual traits or virtues. Again, when we think of decision making, effective decision making, we tend to take a highly superficial approach. First do this, then do that. If it's complicated, do this other thing. If that doesn't work, try this. And when we make those moves, first of all, we misrepresent what's happening in the mind, in fact. And we truncate our thinking. And we fail to see alternatives. And we fail to see even that we have big decisions that we need to make. But we also fail to see how these intellectual virtues and the cultivation of these intellectual virtues are essential to effective decision making. Because we don't make, first of all, effective decisions in a vacuum usually. We affect other people. We influence other people, and we are influenced by other people as social creatures. And we, if we approach problems in a formulaic, or let's say a skills-based approach, as in the following: gather this relevant information to solve this problem, state the problem, what are some possible solutions, have you thought through all of the implications. Some of these moves we're making right here, and those are good moves. But in real life, one of the big problems that we face is that people are coming to these decisions and discussions about making decisions with, let's say, intellectual baggage. So instead of coming to meetings and discussions embodying these intellectual virtues, we as humans tend to embody the opposite of these virtues. So let's just take intellectual humility as an example. All of us are often the opposite of this, or embody the opposite of this, which is intellectual arrogance, thinking that we know more than we know. When we are aspiring to these these intellectual traits, then we are continually trying, for instance, to distinguish, in fact, between what we know for sure and what we don't know. We're exhibiting, we hope, or embodying intellectual humility, and I'm giving you shortcuts to this because there's more, obviously, to this theory. But a main point I'm trying to make here is that often people fail in their decision making because of their intellectual arrogance, because they already believe that they are the way, the truth, and the light, and they don't have anything to learn. They already have all the answers. And so when you give them an alternative, when you offer another solution, what happens is they give you reasons why they can't consider those. And in other words, they're exhibiting intellectual arrogance. They can't hear you. And so that's one example of an intellectual trait that is essential for effective decision making. If we're good at decision making, then we're good at understanding what we don't know. And we're very careful not to overstate what we do know. And we often will say things like, well, no, that's not true. And then, wait a minute, maybe it is true. Maybe I don't have all the information. You're right. That's another point of view. I haven't considered that. Let me back up a minute, because I was thinking of it this way. And what I'm doing here is trying to exhibit and to embody in my own mind a movement from a place of intellectual arrogance, where I'm walking and saying, no, I already know the answer, to, wait a minute, I need to really rethink and regroup, because that rethinking and regrouping doesn't happen like that. I already believe I know the answer. And now you're giving me some better reasoning. It's going to take me a minute to adjust to that. But I can't adjust to it if I don't have something called confidence and reason happening in my thinking. In other words, I can hear you at all, though I think I already know the truth, because I have confidence that in the final analysis, good reasoning will carry us through, and that we're looking for the best reasoning in a given situation. We're not looking for a given person's reasoning, but the best reasoning. So if on a given point, as it turns out, my reasoning is the weakest of all the people in the room, then I want to see that, and I want to see that as soon as possible, and I want to hear the other ways of thinking that are superior to my own, and I want to enter those in good faith, those viewpoints, and I want to be moved by those better ways of thinking. When I'm doing this, I am trying to embody, I'm trying to achieve, or to reach, let's say, this virtue of confidence and reason. So think about this for a minute. Let me have you just take a couple of minutes and consider the intellectual virtues. Consider specifically how the lack of these virtues affects your decision making in your daily life. I focus specifically on two: intellectual humility and confidence in reason. To what extent are you intellectually arrogant, and to what extent does that intellectual arrogance impede your decision making ability? And to what extent do you embody confidence in reason? In other words, to what extent do you really listen to the other side, and can you be moved by that argument that's better than yours? Especially when you think that you already, as it were, know it all, or know much, or know what is important to know within a given domain. So process for a few minutes. The question again being, to what extent do you lack these virtues, and does the lack of these virtues affect your ability to make effective decisions? Just for a couple of minutes. So let us continue, and I want to make one other primary point about the intellectual virtues. And I want to mention that in our theory, in our primary theory, and by that I mean the theory that has been developed through the Foundation for Critical Thinking for the past 35 plus years, beginning with our founder's work, Dr. Richard Paul, in the 1980s, and prior to that. What Paul did is he pulled together the language of critical thinking in a way that's just very helpful. He developed the concept of the elements of reasoning. He developed the intellectual standards in a cluster as we understand them now, and he developed the concept of intellectual traits. Further, he and other Paulian scholars have focused on the barriers to intellectual development, therefore the barriers to effective decision making, and we can see these in the opposites of the intellectual traits. And that is the problem of, let us just term this egocentric thinking, and the problem of, again, just as a quick term, sociocentric thinking. To understand why we often don't make effective decisions, we have to understand not only that we often just lack the language, and we lack alternatives, and we don't think out of the box, and we can't relax our mind to consider alternatives. We also come to problems and issues often as highly egocentric and or sociocentric persons. And I'm just going to unpack this ever so slightly for us right now. We often see in meetings, for instance, people who are oriented toward us in a highly egocentric way. In other words, to them, it's their way or the highway. They can't hear anything that we're saying. They lack intellectual humility. They're highly intellectually arrogant. They lack the ability to enter other points of view, and so they're very close-minded. They're also sometimes or often selfish persons. So when you think about egocentrism, think of rigidity in thought and think of being selfish. Now, this is a shortcut, and there's much more here, but for the purposes of this discussion, students often come to class as highly egocentric persons, just as we do, and they often fail to see how their egocentricity is affecting their ability to make good decisions in their lives, because they're so focused on the here and now, the immediate gratification. They lack intellectual perseverance. They don't have the concept of intellectual perseverance. It's something that very few humans really understand, because we don't know what it means to intellectually persevere through intellectual difficulties. So we have the problem of egocentric thinking, laziness, uh, and thinking that we already know everything that there is to know. Then there is the problem of sociocentric thinking, and this affects, again, all of us, because we are highly uh, social creatures. We think in herds. We think in group think without realizing that we are doing this very often. And so we can ask ourselves, well, how is group think or sociocentric thinking affecting the thinking that we're doing as a group right now in making this decision that we're making? And if you observe humans in groups, you can easily see how they influence one another and how early they do in a given meeting. Just stand back and watch. What happens as soon as everyone arrives? Who speaks to who first? Who's in the crowd and who's not? Who's in the in group and who's in the out group? Who's going to be listened to and who's going to be ignored? And why are they going to be ignored? You see, these are some of the hidden questions that affect our ability to make good decisions that we often ignore, but they're the great elephants in the room that we can't afford to ignore. And so sociocentric thinking and egocentric thinking are concepts that we want to understand, we need to unpack, we need to relate to the intellectual virtues, we need to understand how difficult it is to achieve these virtues because of these intrinsic forces within us that lead us to do things that are irrational, behave in all kinds of irrational ways, to make irrational big decisions, and to stay with those decisions and not to change them, though our lives will be much better if we did change them. The mind easily traps itself through egocentric thinking. The mind easily thinks that its way is the right way. All it needs is one other person to validate it very often, or two or three other people. And just because we're being validated by our colleagues does not mean our thinking is of high quality. The question is, are we adhering to intellectual standards when making decisions? And are we embodying these intellectual virtues? Because it's through this embodiment that we will achieve the level of self-development that we're capable of, and that we will be able to foster in the long run truly fair-minded critical societies. I want to invite you to go further in our book, Tools for Taking Charge of Your Professional and Personal Life. I want you to recognize along with us that anything that's worth learning is going to take some time, and we're only beginning to get into these concepts. I want to invite you to attend our upcoming international conference. We offer this for you to join us. We believe in online learning, but we also very much enjoy the brick and mortar process. We all come together once a year to celebrate our work, to learn from one another, and to be able to go into these conversations much more deeply. And you may also want to join us for our follow-up Fellows Academy. Critical thinking, if taken seriously, is something that happens over the long run. You're making big decisions every day by living the life that you're living. The question is, are you commanding that decision-making process? And do you have tools that you're actively using for moving forward and cultivating your own mind? We've been focusing on some of these tools. I've covered a lot of ground, but I would say if you're doing one thing well every day, you're taking one idea seriously in critical thinking every day, and you're really bringing that idea into your thinking and giving it life. That's the idea. So I've offered many possibilities. Start anywhere, and you'll see that the race is to the tortoise. It's not to the hare. We need many more tortoises in critical thinking to create the world that we're capable of creating. Thank you. I'm Linda Elder. We'll see you next time.